Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing workshop. In this workshop, we bring in speakers from across the country to discuss their research with the NDSU community, and topics focus on innovation, opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. So I'm really excited today and I've gotten to meet Dr. Colleen Haight today, and excited that she's here. And we have Dr. Ray March, who worked with Dr. Haight at San Jose State University. And so I'm going to have Ray, who is a scholar in the Challey Institute, give the introduction.
Thank you, John. So I had the great pleasure of working with Dr. Haight for my first year out of graduate school when I was teaching at San Jose State University. Probably about 3/4 of the way through that year, I got a call from a professor at North Dakota State saying, hey, would you like to come out here and interview? Maybe we'd be interested in employing you. And I can remember thinking, I'd been in California for 6 to 8 months at that time. I was thinking, so if I go to North Dakota, I could have a gun. Gas wouldn't cost $4 a gallon. I wouldn't be paying nearly $3 grand in rent for a 2-bedroom. I wouldn't be commuting 2.5 hours one way to get to work. And while I'm ranking all the pros and the cons, as I typically do when I make a big decision, I looked at the con list and I said, North Dakota State won't have Colleen Haight. And that almost broke the tie. So I'm extremely happy to see Dr. Haight again, and I'm very pleased that I'll get to share her with you. All she gives, I know will be a great presentation. So to introduce her, Dr. Colleen Haight is a professor and associate chair of the economics department at San Jose State University. Dr. Haight teaches a wide variety of courses at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. Her research is currently focused on explorations of the business regulatory environment and the economics of religion. She served as the chair of the economics department, chair of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, and associate dean for undergraduate education. Prior to the academic world, Dr. Haight worked in both software development and the airline industry. She has served on the board of directors, one as board chair and as CEO, for 2 mid-sized nonprofit enterprises that serve the needs of the elderly in her community. She has a PhD in economics from George Mason University and an MBA with a concentration in finance from Notre Dame de Mariu University. So without further ado, Dr. Colleen Haight.
Well, that was probably the nicest introduction I've ever had. So thank you very much for that. And thank you all for letting me join you today. I'm just going to bring up my notes here so I don't say anything too foolish. There we go. All right. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. I do really appreciate seeing your faces. It's nice to get back to actually seeing faces. Well, for the most part, I see a lot of masks too, but thank you for being here. I also want to, did this turn off maybe? Uh-oh, I think it may have turned off. There it is. Okay. I also want to thank the Challey Institute for global innovation and growth for bringing me in. I know they have limited funds and have to make choices with their scarce resources, as all good economists do. And in particular, I want to thank Ms. Callie Christensen and Mr. Tate Reinhardt because they handle all of the really tedious logistics of getting me out here. And because they did all of the tedious work, I didn't have to. So I'm very much in their debt. So let's go ahead and get into the meat of this. It is quite possible. Maybe I'm just not pointing it in the right direction. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. So when you read the title, and you may have been told that I'm an economist, you probably thought, well, you know, the title of this presentation, I think this poor woman just got lost on the way to the religious studies department. But it's not true. There's actually quite a nexus between economics and religion, and that is one of my favorite fields. It's a niche field, but it is quite interesting, and I hope I can convince you of that as well as we move along. So if you think about it, economics is about why people do some of the wacky things that they do, right? How do we make these choices given our scarce resources? And if you also think about it, and I don't want to offend anyone, but some of the wackiest choices we make tend to be with regard to religious observance. So we do all sorts of things. When I was in college, it was quite common then to have Hare Krishnas on campus. I never see them anymore. I'm sure they're still out there. You may remember that. If you're of a certain age, there were these kids basically shaved their heads, wore these orange saffron robes, and seemed to have a very strong attachment to playing tambourines. And of course, they wanted to draw you into whatever their religious observance was. So we see a lot of unusual behavior. These were not poor kids. It's not like they couldn't afford more clothes than orange robes, but they had given up some of their worldly resources in order to practice their religion. And that, I think, is the essence of what makes economics of religion interesting. People do make investments in their religious beliefs and observations and how they live their lives. And because in economics, we think of people as rational actors, we say, okay, rational actors have a goal. They weigh the costs and the benefits, the marginal cost, marginal, all that stuff you learn in class. We all make these calculations and we decide, is this investment that I'm making in religion, am I going to get a return on that investment? And if that return is large enough, of course, you invest and there you go. Off you are. Bob's your uncle, as they say in Australia. So this is why you can blend economics and religion so well and use the economic tools that we learn to talk about or analyze some of the behavior we see. Now, this is not necessarily a new thing. Adam Smith observed in The Wealth of Nations that we have really two types of ways that politics and religion interact in society. The first type one, I'll call it, is state-controlled religion. And it works like this. If I'm the king and you are the religious leader, I give you monopoly privilege in our society. You are the religion, no other religions are allowed. We want to keep them all out. And that, of course, benefits you, the religious authority, because now you have a captive audience. How does that serve me? Well, I can usually then claim divine right to rule because after all, you, the religious authority, are going to compensate me for my kindness and generally give me the benediction I need to convince people to follow me. Now, I would generally need that if my policies aren't that great and people really don't want to follow me. So having that religious authority helps because, well, you can't stand me, but you're not going to defy your God. So there we go. It's a very nice symbiotic relationship that we have. So that's the type one. Now, type two, we also saw, starting with the United States. It may have existed elsewhere prior to this, but it was observed in the United States, or what would become the United States, what was the United States then. That's free market faith. So we do not have a designated religion, and we haven't, although we were founded predominantly by Christians. So there's that heavy Christian influence, but there were different types of Christians that came over, and not everybody agreed on how that religion should be observed. So again, we have that. But what we did have, thanks to our founding fathers, were some very strong and fair, or at least the perception of fair institutions that govern the society. So we had a great constitution that we worked up, et cetera, that led people to have faith in the fairness of our system of government. So we didn't need to have our government, or our government did not need to secure their right to rule through appealing to a higher authority. So didn't need that. So we get free market faith. Now, free market faith is kind of cool. We currently have a very diverse market. It is a very competitive market in religion. The US now boasts about 4,300 unique religions. That's an awful lot, but they're out there. Now, a lot of them are just, I would say, variations on a theme. You know, there's lots of versions of Christianity out there. There's a few different ways of observing Judaism. So, you know, they're out there, but there's a lot of, you know, the Hare Krishnas and the other types of sects that have evolved over time. So we have lots of this. Now, my co-authors and I, Larry Iannacone and Jared Rubin, we discovered a third alternative. So we have type 1, type 2, we proposed type 3, and we call it the neutral nexus. This is another relationship between the state and the church that exists that is not quite what we have in these two. So in the neutral nexus, you generally have a shared culture, shared language, and shared religion. But you have different factions that are sort of always fighting with each other about whatever. It can be about land use, it can be about resources, all sorts of things, but you have some things that bind you together. And having the shared religion also allows you to then have a religious authority that you can appeal to, that because it's not part of the other divisions, is neutral. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. That is the lesson we get from Delphi. So let's move on and talk about Delphi. So no story, no presentation is complete without a sexy version on a pedestal breathing fumes. So I've brought that to you. This is one of the artistic renditions of the Pythia, or the Oracle, that was at Delphi. And she's, you know, a nice, attractive young lady. Oh, before I get to her, let's talk about Greece, because this jumped ahead on me. So before we get to the virgin who's high there, this is Greece in the 8th to the 6th century, or 4th century before the Common Era BCE. And you can see that there's a lot of names up there. These are not countries, but they are small city-states. They were all independent. So we have, let's see, I think one of these, that one works here. We have Sparta down here, you've heard of, Athens, Thebes, Olympia. These are all independent city-states ruled by rulers, not any collection of federation. They're just all in there. They're all fighting. They all have the same religion. They all have the same language and the same culture. So it's all there, but they're constantly bickering with each other during this time because they have not been brought together. And part of the reason is the terrain, although you can't see it here, I don't have a topographical map, but the terrain is rather unfriendly or unsuitable for unification. There are lots of little pockets where these clans can live and operate that are easily defensible. So if you want my resources, I can keep you out. And if I want your resources, you have a pretty good way to keep me out as well. So there's a lot of infighting that goes on, but generally they try to get along on religious matters. At this time, Corinth, let's see, where's Corinth? It's right there. Sparta, Athens, Thebes, those were the major military sites where they had more armies. But most of them had, you know, it's like, okay, we're a clan and, you know, you stronger types in the audience, you are my warriors. And let's go fight because, you know, we have to. So sort of worked along those lines. Now, when we're talking about the religion, of course, because they do share a religion, every town had an oracle. Every town had a high virgin sitting on a pedestal sniffing fumes. And that is an interesting fact because Delphi was by far the most trafficked and the most popular of these temples. which begs a question. Why on earth would you travel all the way to Delphi, which is in the circle there? But if you're in Sparta, that's a long way to go. You have a lot of land masses up there. You have a gulf that comes in. I think it's the Gulf of Corinth. And you have a little bit of a landmass that you can go around. But look, Thebes and Athens are just right there. It's not going to be a safe trip for you because you have to go through other people's territories to get there. But people did. So how does the oracle work? Well, everyone had a temple. Most of the temples were on some focal point of land. So they sat on a hill, for example, many of them on a hill that could be seen. People could get there. When they got there, there was often a virgin sitting sort of on a crevice, because what was not known is there was a lot of volcanic activity in this area. So there were fault lines, there were fissures. Up through these fissures would be these sulfuric fumes that would come, and they would filter through the bituminous limestone. Well, it turns out if you filter sulfur through bituminous limestone, you basically have the effect of sniffing glue. So they have this virgin sitting on a pedestal over her fissure with these fumes coming up. The woman is sniffing glue, and she is asked a question by a petitioner. She might be a little bit high. She might be a little bit incoherent. So she flails around a little bit and says something that just doesn't make any sense. All right, well, how is that a good thing? Well, what happens is there is always a priest right there with her. The priest interprets what she says because she is speaking the god of Apollo. His words are coming through, not hers, and that's why we have a hard time understanding. But don't worry, we've got the priest there to interpret this for you. So you ask a question, you get an answer, it's interpreted by the priest for you so that you can understand what the answer is, and you go on your merry way and see what happens. So that is how it worked. That is also how it worked in Delphi, which is here. You see our young priestess there. We also have here, I like this photograph because it shows you the temple of Apollo right here, and this interior chamber right here where our young lady would sit. And you can see that there's a couple springs up through here near the chamber and bituminous limestone. As the fumes are coming up, they're getting strong. But one thing they did in Delphi that they also did at some of the other shrines, these springs, they would have that poor virgin soaking in the water for a little bit, which also contributed to her condition. And then they'd stick her on over these fumes, and there you go, ready for your prophecy. Now, Delphi operated only one day a month, and it only worked in good weather. So the winter months, we were sort of closed down. Now, the other thing to notice about this is you see there's a big theater up here, a big amphitheater. And what you don't see are lots of other hospitality establishments. Because think about this. You're coming from Sparta. It's a long, grueling trip. You're the king or the queen, usually the king back then. So you come all this way, you've survived the dangers, you brought your army with you because, well, you need to be defended. And you brought your cooks, you brought some livestock. I mean, this is back then, there's no Holiday Inn, there's no restaurants. So you have to bring everything with you. You need people to set it up. You don't want to do the work yourself. You're the king after all. So you've gone all this way. You finally make it to Delphi. And Delphi is, you have to know where it is. Because back then, you couldn't even navigate by the stars. Because according to your faith, the stars moved randomly because that was the gods doing stuff in the heavens that you didn't understand. So if you saw a comet, it could be one of the gods throwing a spear at another one. You just don't know. So very tricky journey. You get up there, you're starving, you're out of provisions, your people need rest. Delphi had one of the largest hospitality industries in this world. So There were big markets where people could, get new materials, new food, new goats, whatever you need. They could engage with the local citizens. As you probably are aware, the Greeks were not necessarily a prudish group, and there was lots of personal services and entertainment available. There were also sporting events. There were religious festivals, huge hospitality. Think Vegas, only it's a lot older. And we're not sure that things that happened there stayed there. So you have this environment that you get to. Now, we know that the Oracle operates only one day a month. And when you arrive, that may be 3 weeks away. So you take the time and you enjoy yourself. Now, the cool thing is that Delphi was a little different, and they had all sorts of events there. The priests and the priestesses only worked one day a month. What did they do the rest of the time? Well, they either worked in the establishments or they participated in whatever the establishments were doing. So they were out there in the public. So let's say Sparta and Athens are going to fight, and there's a strategy to be negotiated and the kings are worried. Well, you may both be there at the same time. So let's say I'm the priestess and this gentleman here is our priest, and maybe we have a couple backups, which we do. So we're all out and we're listening to all the gossip and all the chat. Hey, aren't you in conflict with Sparta? Because how's that going? What's going on? You talk and you get information. So it turns out that because Delphi was neutral, and it was kept neutral by the surrounding city-states, because it was neutral, the information would not be biased. Now, I mentioned that every place had its own temple, right? Well, if it has its own temple, why on earth would I travel all the way to Delphi through this dangerous area to talk to someone when I can talk to someone maybe a couple blocks away at home? Well, here's why. You happen to be the king of Sparta. Sparta has a temple. Well, remember that type 1 interaction that Adam Smith talked about. The temple supports the king supports the temple. When the king goes to ask the priest at his own temple what is going to happen, what do you think the priest is going to say? I'm thinking he's going to tell the priest or tell the king anything the king wants to hear, which means he will get biased advice. Now, this is important if you're a king. If you're simply a guy who wants to marry a girl and you go to the oracle to say, is this the right person for me to marry? The stakes are sort of low. If you marry the wrong person on the advice of the oracle, who may have just, tossed some dice, well, usually you can sort of justify that. You can say, well, we don't know what the gods' plans are. These plans are not for us to know. I am meant to be with this person, even though I can't stand her. So you can sort of talk that away. Now, what are the costs of that? Well, a couple people might be miserable. What is the cost of bad advice to a king who is contemplating war? They're huge. So because of the high cost, you're willing to invest a little bit more in that travel to Delphi to make sure you get an unbiased answer to your inquiry. Now, here's the other really cool thing. We hear that the advice was pretty darn good. So let's take a look at what was being asked. Here are some of the inquiries, and it's over time. So from the 8th century, they sort of took a little bit of a nosedive before we had the growth in the inquiries. Now, this growth happened because Delphi had all of these hospitality industries, it was maintained as neutral. People knew they could go there safely. There was no conflict allowed in the area. And, you know, they could have unbiased sporting events. So if we wanted to see who was the fastest, we could do that. Think of the Olympics, which was in another town that was not easily accessible and also maintained its neutrality. It started there. So we have that happening. So if you want to ask a question, what do you ask? Well, it's a religious establishment. So of course, religious inquiries are going to be rather important. State inquiries. So these are the kings are asking a lot. There's not a lot of the personal stuff. The domestic stuff, the who should I marry? What kind of a child am I going to have? You know, should I go into farming or should I start making military weapons? Those types of inquiries, again, fairly inexpensive. The only people who are going to be there asking that stuff are the locals, not the other people traveling, because they'll just go see their own temples. So the state inquiries are interesting, and they peak at about, between the 4th and 5th century. Then they take a nosedive. You know, by the 2nd century, they're gone. Well, what the heck happened then? Philip of Macedon. He actually came a little bit earlier than that, but he was unifying all of Greece into Greece, as opposed to all of these little individual clans. And as he did so, he also took over being the political power in charge of Delphi, rendering it less useful politically for state inquiries. Now, were these good prophecies? You might be thinking, well, you know, you go to the county fair and you go up to the Zoltar machine, you put in your quarter or whatever it takes now. And the guy in the turban, you know, mechanical guy does some things and then out comes your fortune. How accurate is it? Well, it's usually pretty accurate, but why? Because it's so darn vague that it can't possibly be wrong. So it could say something like, you will have a wonderful thing happen to you. Okay. Where? When? How? It's so open-ended that if I told you all, you will have a wonderful thing happen to you. Some of you might have that happen today. You get an exam back and you got an A. Some of you might have to wait until next week when your mom makes you your favorite dinner when she visits or something. But you will have something wonderful happen to you. There's no doubt about that. And because I haven't put a time frame or any details, guaranteed to come true. That's how to become a fortune teller. Now, the interesting thing about these inquiries here is that some of them were recorded and some of it was passed down. And in Plato's time, and Plato lived quite a bit later, he was, you know, closer to the 1st century AD or CE, Common Era. And when you read what he has to say, he tells us that the prophecies were very detailed. Well, they could be yes or no answers. Will I win this war? No. That might be it. It could be, you know, will I don't know, how will I prevail in this conflict? And that could be, well, you know, you're going to meet up in this area and you're going to ambush this other one, and it's going to happen, you know, here and here because, by the way, we've talked to your generals, so we know what's going on. So the more information that was there, the priests and the priestess often knew the question the petitioner was going to ask before they even asked it, which is kind of cool. I mean, you know, there must be some greater power speaking here. This is the word of Apollo after all. So we had very specific and very accurate information that was given out because the priests could go to this neutral location where they had both sides of the information coming in. They could gather that information and then redeliver it to those who asked. Now, in a lot of times, you know, this did have a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It could be that, you know, I'm so devastated that I'm going to be ambushed that, and this is the will Apollo, for goodness sake, I can't fight that. That maybe you don't risk as many men in that fight. Maybe you don't put your best effort or your best horses or your best artillery there. Maybe you scale back a little to save that because you just don't want it to be crushed. I don't know, but I think there might be. That's a better question for some of our psychologists in the room. So that is how the Delphic mechanism worked in general. All right, that's a cool story, right? But the fact of the matter is it's one example, N of one. That does not a trend make. However, we also see more occurrences. And the most interesting one is back here in Shiloh. So again, probably not biblical scholars in the room, but the Hebrew Bible, about the first half of or so is dedicated to Shiloh and the tribes of Israel. So the Israelites, as the story goes, are leaving Egypt. They're following Moses into the desert. They get to Mount Sinai. They receive the word of God. And then they take it and they resettle in the land of Canaan. Canaan is an old school name for Palestine and Israel. So here we have a map of where the 12 tribes of Israel ended up. And let's see, you can see here, Shiloh is right here, sort of in the dead center of it all. For context, Jerusalem's down here. So you have these 12 tribes. Now, why does this have anything to do with a bunch of Greeks? Well, what we see is these 12 tribes, like the Greeks, have a shared culture. They have shared language. They have shared religion. And like the Greeks, they fought like cats and dogs. So even though they were all the same people, they had these divisions that carved them up into 12 different groups. Then there were the Levites. The Levites were not party to any of these groups. They were the priestly class. So when we get to Canaan, they have to decide who's going to live where. And this map here sort of designates which of the 12 tribes had which areas in the Holy Land. There is no group up there labeled Levite, you will notice. The Levites, as the priests, were not given any land, but they were given sort of temples. So each area would have some temples. The main one was located in Shiloh, which is that little speck right there that I mentioned. So Shiloh is, again, a focal point. It's sort of up on a hill. The remains, you can still see them today, or where the hill is, where it's supposed to be. It was a big tent, apparently, from some of the literature describes it as a very large tent that housed the Ark of the Covenant. So, Indiana Jones type stuff is going on here. We have the Ark right there. This is the main temple of worship. So if you are one of the tribes and you have a dispute with another one of the tribes, how do you resolve it? You go to Shiloh, you speak with the Levites who do not have a dog in the race. They don't own land. They aren't part of any tribe. They can be trusted to be neutral. And they give advice. So they would arbitrate all sorts of disputes. They would do mediation. They would cast lots to determine things like who gets this piece of land. Well, let's let the divine decide. And there it is. Now, what's kind of cool about this is they also got together there to decide who's going to be the first king, because they transitioned to a monarchy. Now, when they transitioned, they were still sort of separate at first, but as they coalesced together, which happened under King David, which was the second king, I believe, well, they didn't need the Levites anymore. In fact, David moved everything at Shiloh, including the Ark of the Covenant, back to Jerusalem, which was, of course, where the seat of power, state power was. So we go back to another instance of where the state has grabbed the authority of the religious authority for himself. So it's kind of a cool story there. Now, great stuff if you're interested in religion. I'm guessing that maybe not all of you are as interested in religion as I am. I think it's fascinating. But maybe you're thinking, well, what the heck what's the relevance of this? Well, it is relevant because if you think of that Nexus thing, we see that in secular institutions as well. And the best one is not on that slide. It's on the slide in between. This one here, Washington, D.C. So think of the founding of our country. You all know the story. We had Benjamin Franklin and all the signers of the Declaration of Independence in what city? Anyone remember? Philadelphia, exactly. Well, we wrote the Constitution there. We wrote the Declaration of Independence there. We designed the country, the federal system, the state. We designed everything there. Why is Philadelphia not our capital? Very good reason. It's not neutral. It's in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was one of the states. If Pennsylvania could have it, why couldn't Maryland have it? Why not New York? Why not Rhode Island? And if Pennsylvania did have the capital, would the capital then be more likely to be sympathetic to the needs of Pennsylvania and not help your state, which was not Pennsylvania? Well, that's a problem. You have to have at least the perception of impropriety here. You have to have that lack of bias that lets people have confidence that what is being decided at this level is fair. So how do they do it? They picked a piece of swampland that nobody wanted. Now, some people would say that Washington, D.C. is still a swamp today, but I suggest it was much worse back then. In this photo, you can see right over here, you can't see it too well because the writing is a little smudgy. That is the White House, such as it was. It wasn't the one we have today. It's shaped a little bit differently because that one burned down. And then you'll see way over here is the Capitol. Also not quite like today, but closer. And there is Pennsylvania Avenue. What a name. At least got that recognition. Pennsylvania Avenue right there. Now you will notice that it crosses a lot of water. And in fact, this body of water here, Deer Creek, is not the Potomac, which is now the only body of water in Washington, D.C., and it runs around the outside. This was the middle of the swamp because they hadn't drained it yet. That took some time. So we have Washington, D.C. then, which is neutral. Today, how many senators does Washington, D.C. have? Anyone know? It's not the same as every other state. 0, I see it. 0. In fact, their license plate on it says taxation without representation, which is supposed to be a bad thing, right? Well, they don't. They do have one representative that attends the House of Representatives meetings, cannot vote. So in essence, they have no representation. So it is very neutral. They have no stake in this. They decide the federal rules, and there is the perception, if not the reality, that there is fairness involved because all of the states are equally represented and no one state has a home field advantage. All right, so that's kind of cool. Again, it's only one secular example, and of one again. All right, how many of you attended grade school and remember it? Well, probably most of you, but you may not remember that awful exercise you had to do, and we all had to do it, which was name all of the state capitals. You got to memorize that, right? What made that so hard? Maybe it wasn't for you. It was hard for me because, I'm sorry? Mostly on the East Coast, so we don't see it as much, but there's another good reason. You've never heard of any of the towns. Now, a few of them you have, but let's take North Dakota. Why is Fargo not the capital? It's the biggest city. Instead, it's Bismarck. I got to tell you, growing up in California, I'd never heard of Bismarck. I thought that was some guy in Germany. But there it is. It's not alone. Illinois. Anyone remember Illinois? Springfield, not Chicago, much bigger city. How about Kentucky? I had to look it up. It's not Louisville. Frankfurt. Are you from Kentucky? You've been there. Okay, because I'm thinking nobody else knows that. We just don't know these things, right? Because, well, why would we? Now, that neutral nexus does play a part. My theory, and this is completely unsubstantiated. I was talking to some of your professors about this earlier today. Why not Fargo? And my theory is that it's too close to Minnesota. It could be biased in the direction of things Minnesotan and not represent the interests of North Dakota quite as well. So it's a possibility. In California, our capital is Sacramento. It's out in the middle of nowhere. And again, part of the issue is we have San Francisco, we have Los Angeles, big, powerful cities that do not agree on stuff, shared culture, shared language, no shared religion, but it's, sort of the religion of California. And they don't agree. Most of the disputes are over water. You need a neutral entity that is going to be deciding the policy for the various parts of the state. So we do see this as well. And there are many, many examples of these types of things. Again, just try to think of those state capitals or borrow your niece or nephew's the little plastic menu that has them, because some of us might need reminding. I had to look a lot of this up. All right, so that is the neutral nexus. And at this point, since we have about the right amount of time left, I'm going to turn it over for some questions. Then, thank you. I hope that was somewhat entertaining. I know you didn't come here for religious history chat necessarily, but do you have any questions you'd like to ask? Yes, sir. Ah. Oh.
Vaccination is not good. Okay, someone
Yeah.
So what's the role of religion or politician? This is a religious issue or political issue?
Yes, it is. Both. What we have, because we do have this history of the separation of church and state, we can impose no laws that abridge the freedom of religion. So if you belong to a religion that says, I do not do medical care, my medical care is in the hands of the divine, then there is nothing that the state can do to make you break that. And if they try, that is a great Supreme Court case waiting to happen. Now, is it political? Sure. Think about this. Good old Dr. Fauci. He's neither part of the government, really, though he sort of is, and he's not a religious leader. He's a medical leader. Now, there is some belief in medicine that may be, steal from the fervent feelings that people have about religion. But he's supposed to be somewhat neutral. Do you believe he's neutral? Or do you believe maybe there's some government influence there? I see a few heads shaking. My personal opinion, I can't prove this. I suspect he is highly political. The man is getting paid some good money to be the spokesperson, and he is becoming very famous. That gives him a lot of motivation to say the things that the government, who is paying him to say them, want him to say. So can we trust the information? I would be more inclined to look at the studies myself. Although I'm an economist, I don't read that stuff. So we have to have some proxies for information as well. And that's what makes the COVID situation really hard. Do I want to impose on people's freedoms? I do not. Personally, my opinion, so I am biased. I don't think we should impose forced vaccinations on people. My husband, we have a mixed marriage. He is so in favor of it. He wants to have everyone shot up. So there's a difference of opinion there. I still love him. Other questions? I'm sorry.
So as we leave the classical era and get to the modern era,
Mhm.
do we see a fragmentation in the neutral nexus? And by that, I mean, we have institutions such as courts that are complemented by non-governmental actors within the judicial system. We have governmental actors within, like, big data statistics within different offices. We also have non-governmental actors that complement or sometimes even contradict them. So I guess I'm seeing fragmentation, as we move out of the classical model towards a more modern. Do you see that?
All right. So the question for anyone on video is, do we see some fragmentation of our neutral nexus here in the United States, given that there is, tell me if I paraphrase this right, given that there is so much influence on things like our court system and other areas of our life? Is that about it?
As fragmentation moving out of the classical model.
As fragmentation moving out of this classical model. All right, so my response to that would be yes. Yes, we are. We've seen throughout history that when you have a neutral nexus, in these cases, it has only survived as long as there was no centralized political authority that was able to take over. Do we have that today? I would say that the United States has some growing issues with the neutrality of all of our systems. So Robert Higgs, who's a wonderful economist, I forget where he was. He now lives in Mexico, of all places. But he wrote a wonderful book that I would recommend if you like this political economy stuff, called Crisis and Leviathan. And in this book, he basically tells us that when people feel that their security is threatened in some way, that they will trade freedom for security. So this gets a little bit back to the COVID here, because we have traded the freedom of, you are all wearing masks, which I'm delighted to see you are following the rules, because I believe in following rules of institutions that let me in the door. But I have to say that, well, I won't go there. Anyway, back to Crisis and Leviathan. Anytime you are trading your freedom for security, that gives the state more power over your lives. So 9/11, World Trade Center, we just had that anniversary, right? When we had that, people traded a great deal of their freedom. There's wiretapping and your communications are monitored. And God, when you go to the airport, you get a very personal search in some cases. Maybe, if you just look funny, I don't know. But you get thoroughly searched. That never happened before. You can't wear shoes. You have to, put your computer in a separate, this stuff never happened before. Some of it may be what I call security theater. It may be just a way of showing that we care. On the other hand, some of it may be stopping something, but it's probably not the brightest of the terrorists. It only stops the ones who can't figure out something better. I don't know. We trade that. As we trade things, the government increases in its level of power. As it increases its power and takes over things like the court system, there's a lot of games played when there's a Supreme Court justice nominated. When do you nominate him? When do you get him through? You better get it through before that next election, right? Because it's all a power play to control institutions that were designed to be independent. Same thing with the Federal Reserve. Is the Federal Reserve neutral? They're supposed to be. But there have been studies that have shown that maybe they're not so neutral. They can be influenced by presidents, for example, who want the Fed to, let the money flow, because if the money is flowing, unemployment comes down and it makes them look good right before an election. How neutral is that? Not too. So I believe, in my opinion, yes, we are seeing a degradation, and it may be that inevitable step, because right now we haven't seen a neutral nexus last forever. We've seen it last for a while, and hopefully it will here, even in its degraded state. Excellent question. Other thoughts? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I would say it's a growing area in economics. I would also say that there's also religious economics out there. So that is economics from a particular perspective. There's people who study Catholicism. There's people who, there's a lot about religion that says we should take from the rich and give to the poor, right? That's all over the place. And yeah, that's a nice idea as long as it's voluntary. But there's a lot of people who want to turn that into something that's not voluntary. So you have people using religion for different ends to try to manipulate society. That goes on. I'm not sure I'm answering all of your question. Am I way off base here?
You're very close. I was saying, from the experiences you've had,
Mhm.
how open are people to this religious
Inquiry?
What is the idea of developing it?
Well, how open are people to economics of religion? I would say, there's going to be people who are threatened by it. Because if I am saying that these prophecies may not have been coming from Apollo, that's going to threaten anyone who believes and is certain that they were. And that is belief. Without, what is faith? It's and even in the absence of evidence, you are convinced in the rightness, right? And so, cleverly, I chose to study ancient religions. Today, if I were studying current religions, it might be I might be stepping on some toes because I take a different approach. I'm not taking the approach of this is the divine word of God and we cannot question it as human beings. It's no, it's written down 700 years after somebody died. It's a good story. A lot of people don't want to hear that. And so, yes, I think it's more popular because we see things, suicide bombers, right? We see people who do horrible things, and many times they are affiliated with a religious tradition. Now, they're not following their religious tradition, but they're affiliated there, and people will use that. We see, for example, even in the US, our terrorism can be done by fundamentalist Christians who do not like abortion clinics. We see a lot of bombings. We see less of that now. So it's not that any one particular religion promotes this. None of them promote it. But religion can be used to coalesce a group that is willing to do things in the name of faith that perhaps are very fringy. So I think in that respect, it's very important for us to look at the choices people make in light of their religious behavior as well. There's an excellent book. I recommended Crisis in Leviathan by Robert Higgs. I also recommend Ellie Berman's book, which is called ooh, sorry, Radical and Religious, I believe, or Religious and Radical. It is a book. He studies terrorist activity in light of religious belief and practice and how the two coalesce to make the suicide bombers extremely efficient in terms of economics. So I highly recommend it. It's good. This is good stuff. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Before, there seem to be two different types of neutrality. There's neutrality between groups of citizens, side A, side B. But there's also, you seem later to suggest that there's neutrality between the people with power and the people without. Right? And so we want our government actors to be neutral with regard to their own interests. Right? I mean,
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it?
But is there evidence that, for example, the priest at Delphi was neutral in that way? I mean, I assume he was trying to consolidate his own power as well. Just like the state would.
Okay, so the question, if I can paraphrase for you, is we've seen that there is an assumed neutrality by the priests and sometimes by political figures, but that is that really true? And I would say that let's go back to Homo economicus, right? We're all in it for our own self-interest. That is to some extent true. So if you're a priest and your temple is raking it in because you have this perception of neutrality, you're going to defend that perception of neutrality. Even if it isn't real, you want to make everyone think it is because you are invested in that neutrality. So I would suspect that the priests at Delphi were pretty neutral because it paid for them to be neutral. They also, of course, got a lot of money for these prophecies. Excuse me. Yes, sir.
What are some examples of like a neutral nexus online?
Okay, so a more recent example of a neutral nexus. Excuse me, I got something in my throat. I haven't thought about it. So I'm going to be flying off the cuff here, just as a warning. How about Wikipedia? Wikipedia takes no stand on the information. They depend on the editing by millions of people. And if you put something stupid on Wikipedia, something I think is stupid, I can go in and fix it. So there's a lot of editing that happens, or I can flag it, right? I think you can just flag it as this sounds silly, and that helps. So the information clearinghouse is pretty good. Now, that does not mean any of you should ever, ever, ever use Wikipedia as your sole research source, because it is edited by normal people who are infallible or not infallible. So you need to look at where they're getting their information. And there are sites in Wikipedia, which helps, right? The more sites, the more you can trust that information. But when you're writing your papers, just saying on behalf of your professors, please go to the original sources and check them out. Don't quote Wikipedia. We don't like that. But yeah, Wikipedia, I think, would be one of the better examples of a neutral thing because everyone has access. Wikipedia only cares that it is a good resource that people go there and see ads. It's the best I can come up with. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
So I guess then in the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, could the rise of outwardly partisan special interests in U.S. politics, then is that possibly a reaction to a changing nature of the neutral nexus?
So is our more and more ferocious partisan politics a reaction to the loss of neutrality in the US? Is that about it? I don't know. Honestly, it's hard for me to explain. I was always told as a kid, oh yeah, you don't talk religion or politics at dinner, right? But I don't understand. People can't talk at all now from different sides of the aisle. And I would encourage you to get past that for us, because we're not doing a great job. I'm not sure if it's a reaction, but we need to get over it. I mean, just try to understand things from someone else's perspective, because these are rational human beings that we live with. We just don't always understand where they're coming from. If you can understand where someone's coming from, you might understand why they support something that you think is silly. And that's the first step to being able to get past that divisiveness. I think I'm out of time,
Yeah,
right?
so it's a great example of how interesting the topic is, that people, the questions just keep coming, but we're out of time. So let's give a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.